Thank you so much, Natanya, and thank you to Lee, Scott, and Megan for joining us today to discuss their experiences with the Annual Survey of Museum-Goers. But what is the Annual Survey of Museum-Goers? Every year, we field the annual survey in partnership with the American Alliance of Museums, and our goal is to learn more about what audiences want, including the broader population, thinking about their individual museums in their community, and about museums in general across the country or even in other parts of the world. When we field the annual survey of museum goers, we are looking for three types of information. Who are our audiences? That's where we're looking at demographic characteristics, but we're also looking at their values, attitudes, and motivations for visiting museums. Advisory questions, where we want to gather their advice for us. This might be questions about how a museum is doing. Are they doing well? What could they do better? It can also be advisory questions such as what kinds of exhibitions would they be most interested in? Basically, the kinds of questions where we're going to take those responses and then we're going to adapt to meet their needs. Finally, the lay of the land questions. We ask a lot of lay of the land questions. These are questions that help us understand how different people may respond to content or initiatives that may challenge them or that we as a society don't have consensus on. The inclusion questions that we ask each year in the annual survey are a great example of this. We're not going to take their advice necessarily on inclusion, such as if a sample comes back that's less inclusive, we're not going to stop what we're doing, but it's going to help us calibrate and think through where are going to be the ways that we can most effectively share content with our audience, bringing them forward a little bit more on inclusion. So when we field the annual survey of museum goers, we do it in two ways. First is through a large sample of frequent museum goers. These are individuals who are connected with one or more museums that they're on a communications list, whether email or social media, received an invitation to take a survey, and then took time to do so. These are not casual, sporadic, or non-visitors to museums. The museums that participate in the annual survey of museum goers pay a modest fee, and we then help them send out their survey and then capture their results. Those results then are shared back with them in the form of reports, such as a spreadsheet report with lots of data cuts and comparisons. We'll talk about that in a second. A slide deck with a graphical representation of their results and comparison data, and also a one-page infographic that can help with grants and fundraising as well. And Lee will talk about that in a little bit. So what are those data cuts? I mean, we have a spreadsheet. It has the museum's results on it. It has the overall results on it, but data cuts? Well, let's think it through in terms of this past year's survey. In 2024, the annual survey included over 200 museums and had nearly 100,000 respondents, pretty typical for our annual survey. With that many museums and people, we can run so many data cuts. We looked at detailed peer group comparisons against 33 museum types. So art museums, even different kinds of art museums. We did science centers, but not only that, we could do science centers in communities that also have a children's museum or science centers in communities that don't also have a children's museum, because that matters. We could do natural history museums. We could do history museums of many different types, military museums, presidential museums, things like that. That ends up being a lot of different types of museums. And so we can compare your results against what is some of your best peer groups. We also look at through peer group and budget size. So if you're a regional art museum with a budget of $1 to $5 million, we're going to have a peer group for that. Additionally, we also look at peer groups by geographic areas. Those are a little bit different because those are including museum goers from a wide variety of different museums. It's a really mixed sample, but it's those museum goers from a specific area. So we might run a statewide peer group, such as in Ohio, or we might run a metro area, such as Denver or Miami. If you're in one of those metropolitan or states that has 5 or more museums participating in the annual survey, then you end up getting that geographic data cut automatically in your spreadsheet report. On top of that, we also field broader population sampling. We want to hear from casual visitors, sporadic visitors, and non-visitors as well. And so we do that through this demographically representative sample of usually about 2,000 US adults from across the country. We can also field this in other countries, such as Canada. But right now, we're mostly doing US sampling. It's a demographically representative sample, and we can then cut that data set by those visitation rates as well as through life stage. But we're capturing their values, attitudes, and beliefs. The survey itself is almost identical to the annual survey that's sent out to frequent museum goers, so we have those direct comparisons. So knowing what we want to ask as big questions of who is responding, who's visiting, what their advice is, what's the lay of the land, we do then turn that into actual questions. And there's usually 3 sections of a survey. We usually start off with key benchmark questions on attitudes and visitation rates, usually specific to the museum that's sending out the survey. So this is going to be, how often are your visitors visiting? What do they think you're doing well? What can you do better? Why are they visiting you? But also some questions around their repeat visitation rates specifically. Bookending the survey at the other end, we end up with demographic questions. We want to understand their age and life stage, parental status. We ask gender. We ask if they're a member of the LGBTQ plus community. We ask educational attainment, race and ethnicity, the full battery of questions, including political values, because we have found that political values are now the #1 indicator of how someone's going to respond to content in a museum. The middle of the survey, though, does change from year to year based on the needs of the field. We get input from previous participants in the annual survey, looking at trends and shifts impacting the museum field, have new questions that are arising from previous research. All of these things are our inputs as we think through what are those themes going to be. And for 2025, we have settled on our themes. We're going to be looking again at repeat visitation because that's such a crucial piece that's missing right now for many museums who have not yet caught up with pre-pandemic visitation. The big gap seems to be repeat visitation, so we need to dig a little bit more into that. But we're also going to be looking at social connection. In particular, the social connections that museum experiences tend to engender between family members as well as friend groups. So we're looking at those experiences specifically and asking questions about what is it about museums that make us really good at engendering those connections? What are those other things that are also engendering those connections? And how hard is it now to engender those connections when people are telling us they can't get those connections at home anymore? The other piece we're looking at is community trust and responsibility. But we're looking at it through the lens of what do they feel museums' responsibility to their communities are? What are those responsibilities around preservation or sharing of culture and history? What are those responsibilities for educating children, and maybe in STEM subjects? All those different things. We're thinking about those things and about how we're going to pull from respondents what they think our responsibilities are to our communities. And with that comes trust. And in particular, thinking through this day and age of disinformation, of AI, what are those things they want museums to be doing to support and earn their trust in what museums are sharing? So we'll be writing these themes, a survey based on these themes over the coming months. But at this point, I do want to turn it back over to Lee, who's going to share with us how the Ohio History Connection uses the annual survey in their own work, not only as an organization for all of their sites, but for individual sites as well.
Did folks see the presentation?
Looks great.
Great, thank you. You never know what you see on the screen. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little bit about the organization first. So the Ohio History Connection is a statewide organization that carries out a variety of history services for Ohio and its citizens. So we care for collections, we maintain the state archives, we house historic preservation, and we also have, oops, sorry, I'm having trouble getting my slides to advance. There we go. We also have a network of 50 plus sites, 58 of them, of which 24% have participated in the annual survey over the years. Some of them have participated for 1 year. Some of them have participated since 2017 has been the longest one. So we've had quite a bit of participation in the annual survey, and we use that information in a variety of ways. We've also done broader population surveys. We started doing the broader population survey in the metro area for the Columbus area, which is where our headquarters is located. And then we've expanded to do other metro areas around some of our sites, to finally doing some statewide data collection, looking at our major metropolitan areas and being able to use that information. So we share this information in a variety of ways. We share it with staff, it's shared with funders, it's shared with legislators, leadership and board, and it's tied to organizational outcomes. We use it for fundraising. We also use it to better understand our visitors. I'm going to share a spreadsheet with you. Hopefully that'll work. Because they're so exciting. I'm the person that geeks out on that. Are you seeing a spreadsheet? No.
You might have to reshare your screen, Lee, to show that.
Hold on. Stop share. Reshare. Some technical difficulties here, but it's worth the wait because the spreadsheet is so super exciting. There it is. All right. So Megan, thumbs up if you see it. Thank you. All right, so our spreadsheets are quite in-depth, and I think that's one of the great things about the annual survey. So we have everything from the broader population information to just our specific museum results, which includes all the basic questions that we have, and those are standard questions that are asked year after year. Then we also have historical data. So since we have sites that have done this over the years, we're able to compare year after year to see what changes we have. Wilkening Consulting is wonderful, and they go ahead and highlight those changes for you. So you can look quickly at the sheet, be able to see where you have above what you've had in the previous years and below what you have, what's changed over time. And then also in this spreadsheet, for example, which is for Armstrong, we have history museums, geographic history, and state museums. Because we do a state annual survey, we're also able to compare it to other places in the state. And because we have so many museums that participate, we also have comparisons between museums. We use custom questions, and so those custom questions appear on our spreadsheet. We have the open-ended questions where people tell us, sorry, it's not lining up right away here. We have the custom questions that tell us the open-ended responses for folks. And then we also have things about museum content here, repeat visitation. There you go, the fill in the blank questions. So we're able to look at that qualitative data also and be able to get some more information about what's happening. And so that spreadsheet is really helpful for us. I'm going to go ahead and continue sharing the other presentation. Sorry about the stopping and starting. Do you see a bar chart? Awesome. All right, so what we get is we get a report. This report that we received for the Ohio History Center was 98 pages, which is 98 pages that's packed full of information. So this gives us all of our answers to questions that are everything from the demographic, custom questions, broader population, historical data, the research themes. One of the things that I do is make sure to put things on, like this one was done during the pandemic. I think it's important in the future that we realize, hey, there was a time that we were closed. Therefore, that's why 2021 looks the way it was, because we were closed during the pandemic. And this gives us some context for that. We also are able to look at the Columbus broader population. One of the things that we do is we ask about what other institutions that are visited in Columbus. And so I actually share much of this data with other cultural institutions. Some of them participate, they share their data too. But this gives us an idea of where else people are visiting in our city. And then, of course, you know, not everybody, I love it. I love spreadsheets, but not everybody has the time to spend with spreadsheets or 98-page reports. Wilkening Consulting has started doing a one-pager that's really, really useful. I can tell you that our development department uses this a lot when they're doing grants or just to have some basic information. I also create, like you see in the center, a one-pager that talks about membership. So this is from one of our annual surveys. Our membership numbers that next year went up by 13%. We get the information. I also make some recommendations. Here are some of the things that we need to do. And then something I've started this year is this evidence of impact sheet, which goes and talks about what impact the organization has had. And so those are done around our budget categories, and Megan will probably talk a little bit about this later, but just doing these one pagers. So folks have the ability to kind of at a glance, be able to look and get some information. My metric for success is if I see it hanging up in somebody's office. That makes me really happy. Then, of course, you have some folks that are more on the floor, and this is a document that I created about special events and what people are looking for special events. So they have one of those little hand things that you do, right? So it's a little activity. So our education staff has a copy of this that they're able to use to think about, well, what is it that people want to see when they do special events? So lots of different ways for folks to consume information. I talked about audience growth. We've seen a growth in visitation also at our sites, but this is an example of what I've done for our evidence of impact. And then it also relates to the strategic plan. We try to tie our custom questions to the strategic plan. So one of those areas is the idea about increased awareness of our sites. We actually asked this question in our annual survey and our broader population survey. So we know based on the region of Ohio about the awareness of sites, and we've developed goals how to increase that. And now we have a way to measure it and be able to talk about it. It's the same thing with impact. We often need to explain the impact of our organization. People say, so what? What's the impact of the organization? Well, we actually use a custom question to be able to answer that for us. And so we can look at our impact in different communities, see where maybe we want to focus, see where things are going really well, or maybe where we need to change some things, or is the impact something that we expected or didn't expect? So this is one of our custom questions that we use. And then I'm going to pause there because we're ready to move to Megan's part, and I'll stop sharing. And thank you very much.
I think Scott is going first, but then I'll pick up after that.
All right, Scott.
Thanks, Lee. And I'm going to share screen in a moment here myself as well. There we go. All right, so just a little brief intro here. We heard who I am, but in case those you who are not aware of Connecticut Humanities and State Humanities Councils, we are the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Every state and territory has a Humanities Council, and we are Connecticut's. We do grant making, we do digital learning for the state. We have a state encyclopedia, and we are the Center for the Book for Connecticut. Until the pandemic, we were doing about $700,000 a year in external grant making to most of the state's heritage, history, cultural institutions. In June 2021, was in a meeting at Mystic Seaport Museum when it was learned that we were going to be the recipients of $30.7 million of funding from the state for the upcoming biennium to support the state's larger cultural, arts, humanities, and museum sector. And that was a great day, an exciting moment, but also when we had to start to figure out what does that mean. So we had to figure out what the grant line was going to look like, and you can see some of the information there about what we ended up calling the CT Cultural Fund operating support grants that ended up being awarded in 2022 and 23 to first over 600 cultural organizations and then 700 cultural organizations in the second year statewide. But we wanted to be proactive with this, and in the planning, not just to launch a grant line, we wanted to figure out how we were going to be evaluating the impact of this program to be able to tell the governor and the legislature about what impact those dollars had on the state. So we quickly reached out to Susie Wilkening. We had worked with her previously in Connecticut on work going back really to my earliest days at Connecticut Humanities in 2008. I've now been there almost 17 years. And we had done work with her back then on a survey of visitors to our state's cultural institutions. Some of you might be familiar with it, the CT Cultural Consumer Survey. And we approached Susie about the best ways to try to figure out what our status of states are looking like before these grant funds hit, and then as the grant funds start to get spent and used in our communities. So we did things like create the nonprofit CT Cultural Census. We've launched that each year now from 2021, 2022, 2023, and coming up, we're actually working with Susie and her team right now on crafting what the 2024 survey is going to look like. We also did some broader population work in Connecticut, like Susie talked about, will be part of your annual survey of museum-goers work. And then about 18 months into knowing we had the funding, and 1 year after the funding had been in the state, we approached Susie and started talking to her about, well, maybe it makes sense to do a subset of our museums and look at what impact this funds have had on 20 organizations and run them through the annual survey of museum-goers. And that's what I'm really going to be talking to you about today. If you want to find any of the information I'm talking about here, you can go to cthumanities.org. Under our work, we've got a whole bit of how we can help organizations do data collection, and then all the information I'm sharing is on the data on the cultural sector. So you can find reports on each of the cultural censuses that we did, and we work with Susie on doing data stories. So we know on the most recent cultural census of over 700 nonprofit organizations, we know that over 50% are museums, about just a little less than a third are performing arts. These are organizations that represent over 17,000 jobs in the state, with a huge audience of almost 10 million visitors. And we can dig down deeper into the data here, and a great quote from Anne talking about the way that these funds have helped Webb Dean Stevens Museum improve their K-12 educational offerings. For the annual survey of museum goers, this allowed us to look at a subset of museums, and we tried to be representative of geography and size and institution type. And of the 20 institutions we ran through, we put invitations out to all of the big five, quote unquote, museums we have in Connecticut, our 2 aquariums, our zoo, the Seaport, and the Science Museum in Hartford, but also wanted to have representative art museums, historic houses, arboretums, nature centers. So as best we could to represent the diversity of the types of museums that AAM has in its membership base, and that our survey museum findings would match to national trends. In the end, like Lee said, we got a report for what we learned about our Connecticut museums, and I'll share that with you. And we also got a spreadsheet which helped us to dig down and look at how our Connecticut findings compared to the national survey overall. We also got a subset of how our museums compared to the other museums by discipline, and we were able to compare our subset of Connecticut findings to other state findings, which has been important to us. I'm not going to go through the full report here, but wanted to highlight a few specific parts here for you all. And bear with me as I just scroll down to get to the pages I want to highlight. Thought this would be the easiest than changing views. All right, so you can see our 20 Connecticut museums had over 5,400 responses. We ended up being just under 10% of the number of museums that participated that year, and just over 5% of the responses. So a good representational trend. The survey showed where our findings for our audience was similar to and different from the national pool. Some of the things I'll highlight here: we had a little bit more women doing the survey in Connecticut than was the trend for the full body of the survey that year. And want to go to slide 12. And we had a fair number more parents and guardians than was the trend. So there were things here that were helpful when we find this information to be able to talk about with the state legislature, for example. The state legislature has been highlighting the importance of K-12 education, and especially coming off of the pandemic, in both informal and formal learning environments. So we can talk about the fact that we know that Connecticut audiences, more than the national trend, are using our state's museums as ways to help their children get strong learning experiences. And this hits to priorities that they have had. Want to highlight just a little bit further down on page 48. Oops. We know, as we have been putting these funds out into the state with the state legislature, with ARPA funds, they've funded other programs like CT Museum, CT Kids at the museum, which provided free educational experiences at museums from July 4th through Labor Day for 3 consecutive years. We can see, compared to the national trend, that more people that responded to the survey were saying that because of the economy, because of inflation, they are looking for more local museums and day trips. They're especially utilizing coupons, discount passes. We're looking for free and reduced admission days. These are all things that connect to the money that the state legislature had been helping to support through the operating support grants that we put out there and those programs like CT Summer at the Museum that were allowing equitable access to our state's museums during the summertime. So again, direct facts that we're able to share with the legislature to be able to talk about their priorities as we continue to advocate for this funding going forward. Just want to highlight, things were not completely smooth sailing. So I want to highlight just a couple of the things that we ran into some difficulties as doing this. We wanted to have both big and small organizations do this. We did have one organization that ended up being too small of a list of email contacts to get a representative stable sample. So we ended up switching them out to a different institution. We also had one institution that wasn't comfortable with some of the questions that we were asking that year. We were having political questions that were in there. And even though there was nothing that was politically, one side or the other, they didn't want their members to get questions that were more political in nature. They were looking for that as to be a political free zone as much as that's possible these days. So we did have to make some changes to the original sample set based on responses and based on some of the questions that we were asking. But I think this has continued to be an important tool for us at Connecticut Humanities, our lobbyist, and especially our executive director to be able to have a toolkit available for him to be able to respond to the legislature's needs. We know about our museums. We know how they're impacting their communities. We know how the general public is thinking about us. And with the work we're able to do with Susie with the broader population and the annual survey of museum goers, we know how what's going on in Connecticut compares to national trends, where we're doing better, and how we can utilize that to match up to legislative priorities. And with that, I will turn it back to, I believe Megan is going next.
Thanks. I just want to shout out, I saw some Ohio people in the chat, McConnell Arts Center down the road from me and Ohio Humanities. So just have to say in Ohio, hello. To our friends here. I will also go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So I wanted to talk about the survey from the perspective of a decision maker and how we are, sort of logistically and using the data. So you saw that there is a lot of information that comes in. There are spreadsheets, there is a presentation, there's a lot that's coming in. What is it that I am seeing and how are we using it as an organization? And so another piece of being a part of the survey is that the ability to kind of sit down, take in all the information, but also to sit down with Susie and have a conversation about what is going on. Like, what are we facing? What is the data telling us? What should we be paying attention to? And I think that's an important piece of this puzzle. Because over the last few years, so I should say that I've been executive director here for 2 years, and prior I been with the organization 17, and I have been working with Lee on the collection and usage of this data since we started in 2017. Is that right, Lee? So prior to that, I was overseeing the Ohio History Center in Ohio Village, one of our sites, and then our entire site system. So, every year, talking about this data, looking at this data has been a part of my job. And so taking all of this in, what ultimately ends up happening in my world is kind of zeroing in on kind of like hotspots. What should we really be paying attention to? And what are we hoping to move the needle on? And that may change year to year. And then so having longitudinal data across so many years can really help us see like, oh, all of a sudden something is shifting. So a couple of examples of how we really use the data. I think an example of how things are shifting is that we had a site and experience where people were becoming less and less satisfied. And in that conversation with Susie, she said to me, you know, I think you're going to have to make announcements soon that you do have plans to make changes, because you're losing the goodwill of your constituents. And that was a really important piece of data for us to understand, is that you know, different than like visitation and membership numbers, was maybe this kind of leading indicator that people were being less satisfied with the experience as a whole, and maybe us as an institution. In some of my previous roles, you know, you're, like I said, you get all this data. We're lucky to have Lee at our organization that can help us zero in on like, where are things, what are things that we should be paying attention to? And one piece of data that we zeroed in on one year, and that's really what kind of has to happen, is that you're looking at everything and you're saying, okay, what is it that we really want to focus on? And is there something that we want to make change? So several years ago, there was a question about, you know, do people think that the staff care? And our response rate was really lower than what we were seeing nationally. And, you know, we spent some time from a visitor experience and a customer service perspective discussing, like, what does it mean for our visitors to see that staff care? Because we do care. So how do we, instead of talking about like customer service in a transactional way, we were able to spend some time talking about and sort of embodying what it means to care for our visitors. And then more recently, in my job, is we receive a majority of our funding from the state of Ohio. And every other year, we have to make a case for our funding. We have to request funding. I have to testify about our funding. And the state has gotten actually more data informed in how they are asking us to ask for funding. So they want to know some metrics and they want to see change. So we are leveraging, you know, our, like I said, longitudinal data with the annual survey, but also looking at our custom questions so we can collect data to show how we're making an impact as it relates directly to each of our lines from the state of Ohio. So the little, the sheet you see here directly correlates to our line item around our historic site system. So we're not just saying things anecdotally, we're really showing that data and showing our work. Also with our board more recently, so I'm sure some of you can relate to this idea, is like, nobody knows who we are, or people just make these grand statements. And it's like, well, we have a way to get data around that. So this past year, we used some of our custom questions around awareness, which Lee mentioned already. And so in our organizational goals and our strategic plan, our operational goals, we talk about increasing awareness of the organization. So we were able to like get a baseline awareness of the organization. And that was a complex, we didn't just say like, do you know who we are? Check yes or no, or maybe. We dug in a little bit around awareness of our individual sites. And do they know that the sites are associated with us? And how does that change their opinion of us and the site? And so we're looking at all these different pieces of data and going through that with the board to help them have a much richer understanding of awareness and where we're looking to make change in this next year and by what percentage. And when we were presenting some of this data to the board recently, the great thing about the working in this context is like, this is a vetted professional survey that we didn't just conduct ourselves. You know, we have a long history with it. So any of those normal questions like, well, who did you survey? You know, like the things that try to poke at, they were not able to poke at it. I mean, they tried because they're good board members, right? But it's a really solid, you know, methodology and study, and it's well tested. So I was able to easily move past that, and we can focus in on, okay, well, what kind of change do we want to see in awareness? And let's just stop saying like, nobody knows who we are. we've got these data points, because it's not true that it's not nobody, but it's not as many people as we would want it to be. So let's work on matching methodologies with our goals and the numbers that we have. Also, in my conversations, with Susie and many others, is the political landscape and understanding how politics shapes individuals' views of us, of museums, and how we're being mindful about the words we're using, because we have goals around inclusion and equity, but we also don't want to be waylaid by the political environment. I was just talking to someone the other day where I said, it feels like talking about civics or civic engagement has somehow become a political act, that it's nonpartisan, that it's not nonpartisan. So this is for me, this is a real reality of doing the work and trying to get funding for our organization. And truly, we're supposed to be for everyone in Ohio. And the other things that the data shows us is that museum professionals tend to be way more liberal than Susie's data talks about this, than the general population. And so being aware of our own biases and understanding like how we really are serving all of our audiences. And if we want to achieve our goals about bringing people together and doing this work, how do we navigate the world around us? Right now, I'm in a state that's been in the political debates for some really weird things. And it's, we just have to be attuned to this as well. So I will stop sharing now. And I think next we're going, is it back to you, Susie?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a little bit more nuts and bolts logistics of how this works. The annual survey has a pretty rigid but semi-permeable structure and timeline. Because we want everybody to put their surveys into the field at once, we have a pretty strict timeline, because what that does is it allows us to have that big aggregate set that we can then slice and dice and provide all those reports and all those comps in your reports to make sure you have the data that you need. So this fall, this is when we're planning the 2025 annual survey and opening enrollment to museums. And enrollment is really, really easy. I'll move that, sorry. The first thing that happens starting this fall, technically we open enrollment October 1st, but the secret thing is that the enrollment link is open now. That's when we start putting the survey itself together and enrolling museums. It takes less than 5 minutes to enroll museums, but we want museums to enroll with a hard and fast deadline of February 28th, so we can get everybody's museums out the door in the first quarter of the year and get all that aggregate data put together. The survey itself, what we do is my colleague Jessica in particular works with individual museums to get their survey out the door. We provide a link to the survey, and then we provide it to the museum with sample text, sample graphics, so you can just pop it right into an e-newsletter and send it out to your email list really, really quickly and easily. And we also monitor results as they come in with you. So you see those results coming in on a dashboard. You get a link to a dashboard a few days later, and you can say, oh, I've got a great response, or, ooh, this is a little bit less than we had anticipated. What do we need to do to then supplement and get our data set to a more stable area? But we are strict. Those surveys have to be sent out to those email lists by March 8th, so we can then have time to put all the aggregate results together and into those reports at the end of the month. So that's where we have that deadline. In May and June, reports start going out to the individual museums that participate, and that's when you first get that spreadsheet report, and then a few weeks later, you get that slide deck. We don't leave you high and dry when this happens. When you get that first spreadsheet report, you also get access to a portal off of the Wilkening Consulting website where there are videos that help you walk through, like, what is it that I'm seeing in my spreadsheet? What is it that we're seeing with these written in comments? And then when the slide deck report comes out, more videos appear to help you look at those slide deck and start getting more information and context from what we're seeing from the overall results as well. And then as Megan mentioned, you get time to discuss those results with us and with me and my colleagues. So we do have office hours for all participating institutions. They can pop into a Zoom session with us and ask us questions and see what other things are being asked by other museums. And if you are a Tier 3 member of AAM, which the Ohio History Connection is, you also get a private one-on-one call with either me, Jessica, or Noelle from Wilkening Consulting, so you can get that one-on-one time together to really talk about your results. As Lee and Megan both mentioned, there are opportunities to customize your survey. There are ways to customize who you're surveying and setting up your own comparisons. You can also add on broader population sampling as an additional service. So there's lots of different things that can also happen. But overall, the base fee for participating and what most museums do is $1,250. And that's if you meet those deadlines of getting the survey out the door that first quarter. It goes up to $3,250 if you are outside of that main cycle of surveying. So if you fielded your survey in June, it would cost a lot more. So that's why we really try to push this first quarter launch so we can get all those surveys wrapped up together. There's a lot more information on the Annual Survey website, which you can see there at the bottom of the screen. And as I mentioned earlier, even though we're technically opening enrollment on October 1st, the link is live on that website and enrollments can actually start coming in. And Natanya, I'm going to go ahead. I see that there's a couple questions, so I'm going to go ahead and just address those right off the bat. The first one I'm seeing from Teresa is mentioning what the themes for this year are again, so we'll go back to that. And it's repeat visitation, social connection, and community trust and responsibility. For the repeat visitation, if you get the data stories that we put out every year, so every year after we've done analysis, we start releasing a data story infographics about once a week to the museum field. Everybody can get them. Going over the results that we're seeing big picture. One on repeat visitation is going out tomorrow specifically. And that's what we're looking at, what's going on from pre-pandemic times with museum visitation, how did the pandemic affect it, and are we back to where we were? And one of the big things we keep finding is that people are back at museums. I mean, that yes or no question, have you been to a museum in the past year? We're actually doing really well nationally, but repeat visitation is not back where it was. And that's where we're seeing gaps in museum visitation in particular. It's not that people aren't going to the museum, it's just they're not going as frequently as they were before the pandemic. And that really seems to be a focus of what needs to be addressed of how we get those repeat visitation numbers back up. So we're looking at this in a slightly different way this year than this previous year to really kind of focus in on those individual museums in this upcoming year. And then, as I mentioned, with social connection, that family unit or that family and friend unit coming to a museum to have that time together they can't get elsewhere, and that community trust and responsibility and how we can increase that credibility, but do so in thoughtful and honest ways as well. Looking at that very, very specifically this year. Okay, so that was in the Q&A. Let me look in the chat. There was something I saw. Okay.
I just wanted to mention, I meant to say this as a decision maker, that price for what you get, there's no way that we could do that on our own. And to get all the data from the broader population it's just so affordable for what we get out of it.
Right. I mean, if we were doing if somebody came to us and asked for a custom survey to be created for their museum, it would be tremendously more expensive. Okay, the next question, I'm going to moderate this, is for Scott. The question is, if Connecticut Humanities found more commonalities or differences in the challenges and opportunities their museum's data. So, okay, are we missing a couple of words there? Found more commonalities or differences, I guess, against the national.
I think
What challenges and opportunities does that present for their museum's data?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Susie, what we found was in many of the responses, the Connecticut data was pretty much right on par within a few percentage points, and not statistically significant, but that shows that we're on trend. And even if that's the case, it's the kind of thing where we don't want to go backwards. We don't want to have public support start to have us drop behind. We're doing well, and with this influx of support, we're where the rest of the nation is. The areas that we found were the most different is what I said, really with how we've been serving small children, parental audiences, and folks are looking for equitable ways of visiting institutions, and that's an important thing for us in Connecticut. But other than that, things were fairly similar to national trends, but that is not insignificant in itself. In fact, that just says we got to keep doing what we're doing so we're not falling behind all of our peers.
And one of the data points I remember being a little surprising coming out of Connecticut, and this is around attitudes towards inclusion, is there's this assumption, okay, Connecticut, blue state, they're going to be more inclusive than the national sample. And that wasn't true. From my recollection is that you were actually a couple points less inclusive. And so that also presents some interesting challenges to think through, like, why is that happening in a place like Connecticut? And so sometimes there's confounding data. Okay, the next question, if my museum is in a state where we don't have that great funding opportunity, is there a way we can create a cohort with other museums in our state? So, I mean, yes and no. I mean, once we get to at least 5 museums in a state participating, that's when the opportunities to run with state data really increase, either somewhat or substantially. So like in Connecticut, because we had so many museums participating, we could really run with that data and create this robust Connecticut data set. Ohio has a lot of museums participating as well, not just the Ohio History Connection museums, but also other museums in Ohio. Other states, we're not close to that level of 5, but being able to get to that point where you have 5 museums participating and get that data point about your state it does change it, so you can think about who are those more casual and non-visitors in your state that other museums may be attracting, but you're not getting and you can look at that data in that way. When it comes to broader population sampling, that's an add-on. Typically what happens with broader population sampling is if you want to do that, it's an additional fee of $2,000 and part of that fee goes to purchase that sample of, usually it's around 250 respondents in that geographic area. When multiple museums want that geographic area's broader population sampling, we can at least split some of that fee across those institutions. That part of the fee that purchases the sample, we can split, so it makes it a little bit more affordable. So sometimes when we run broader population sampling, that fee can go down to like $1,400 instead of $2,000 for a museum because multiple museums are using that broader pop data. So that's a way that you can also work together as a state to get the broader pop a little bit less expensively. Okay, the next question is for the Ohio History Connection, and what results have you found that have been most surprising to you?
I think that can kind of vary from year to year. I think that some of what we hear from the questions that come up as the themes for each year, I think some of the surprising information this past year was around those, particularly about K through 12 parents looking to supplement education through museums. That was surprising. I guess you kind of think that might happen, but it actually did. And then I also think that it's around about really having a good sense of what your museum's doing well and what you need to work on. You might think you know what that is, but having that data is really helpful, and those written in comments and the specificity around it. There can be times where they're very specific about what they like or what they don't like. And so you really get to know and understand that. And as you code those responses, you begin to see patterns. And so I think that those are some of the things that have been surprising. Megan, I don't know if there's things for you that have been surprising.
I think that you're right, Lee, that it varies year to year. I guess my general thing with anything kind of with the data perspective is that I really you really have to go into it with a very open mind and sort of dismiss your expectations, so that you can take it in, not feel icky about, like reading all the comments can hurt your soul sometimes. Um, and just being open to what it's going to tell you. So, sometimes there's good surprises, sometimes there's bad surprises, but it's more about like being on a continuous improvement path from my perspective. It's hard to be surprised at this point, I think. We get a lot of feedback. So there's nothing that really stands out, because I think we have Lee's position. We've just been in a place of really having a lot of feedback, and we have to just be mindful, like, are we actually doing a good job using this? Is the data telling us something year after year that we're not paying attention to?
And I think also, I have a lot of conversations one-on-one with tier 3 members of AAM who are doing the annual survey. Even this morning, I had one of those calls. And so I get a lot of feedback from individual museums when they're talking about and thinking about their results. And there will be surprising findings from time to time. But I think because one of the big things that the annual survey does is we're so open with sharing the overall results with the field that even if you've never done the annual survey or never surveyed your stakeholders or your supporters, you should have a good understanding or sense of what museum goers are thinking already, because we shared so much already. And so then when you can then contextualize your results and go, oh, this fits right in with what I expected. It's not really a surprise, but it's validation, or maybe it's not where we wanted it to be and we can pull it up, things like that. So there are never, I don't think there's ever really huge surprises, but there's moderate surprises from time to time, which is kind of interesting. Two of the things that Lee and Megan have mentioned around staff and staff caring, and also the K through 12 education, supplementing education. There are 2 data stories coming out in the next several weeks about those specific topics. We did a data story about perceptions about staff and staff caring and its effects on repeat visitation that will come out. I'm not sure if it's end of this month or beginning of October. And then on October 31st, there will be a data story about how parents and guardians are looking to museums to supplement history education, especially in states where history education has been restricted, imploring museums to be more inclusive. I'm really excited about that data story in particular. So that's coming out on Halloween.
Susie, I think the other thing too for us, thinking about surprising, it wasn't surprising, but it was validating. And I think that's sometimes how this feels, is looking at the COVID impacts, because that was something that none of us have experienced before, and looking at how others were still experiencing the same thing, and we may have been experiencing it in different time frames. But I think that, this survey is kind of lined up with some of those markers during COVID. And so that those periods of isolation really gave us hey, we're kind of all still in this together and experiencing some of the same things and on the same trajectory for recovery.
So there's 2 more questions that I'm going to address, and I can address both of them pretty quickly. One is about which institutions are currently participating. So if you're interested in participating this year and you want to know who else is participating this year, we're not going to really know until the next few months as enrollments start picking up. But you can always ask us, and we can say, these are the organizations in your community or in your state that have already signed up. The other one is asking about the applicability of the survey to Canadian institutions, and we do sometimes get Canadian institutions. We also get institutions from other countries sometimes participating. Overall, it is very applicable. One of the things that we are thoughtful about is how we use language. There's going to be Americanisms in it because that's the primary audience. But what we do for institutions that are not United States institutions is we do a version of the survey that allows a little bit more customization for you to make sure that we're using the right terms, especially like on race and ethnicity. The Canadian census uses slightly different terms than we use here in the United States. And so we make sure we can adapt it so you're using Canadian terms instead of United States terms on that question specifically. So we look through the survey and say, is there anything in here that we're going to need to be a little bit more flexible with institutions in a different country to field this survey? We also have a way to, if the survey needs to be translated into French, working with organizations in Canada to make sure we get that good translation and gain that program so that you can meet those requirements if they apply to your institution in Canada. So you can also ask me any additional questions. If you're in a different country, you can just shoot me an email. I can address those then as well. Is that all the questions, Natanya?
I think so, Susie. Thank you so much. And I think that brings us to time today. So thank you again, Susie, Scott, Lee, and Megan for sharing your insight. And thanks to everyone on the call for joining us. As Susie mentioned, enrollment for the 2025 survey officially launches in October, but at the Annual Survey of Museum-Goers site, you'll see that link is already live. If you're interested in participating and want one of us to follow up with you, feel free to just drop a note in the chat, or you can reply to any of the emails that you received. I'll also include an email address for AAM in the chat as well in just a second. Also just to note that because this program has grown so much over the past 2 years, we do have a limit of 350 museums that can participate in the 2025 survey. So you may want to sign up early. And as Susie also mentioned, data story infographics from the survey have just begun to be shared and are releasing weekly through the fall and into winter. So keep your eyes peeled on social media, AAM's blog, and the Wilkening Consulting website. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day. Take care.